The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Father Miguel Santos stepped out of his modest wooden chapel, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The September air carried a crisp promise of the approaching autumn, and the priest paused to watch the town slowly come to life. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts, horses snorted and stamped at hitching posts, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed with stubborn persistence. At 38, Father Miguel had the lean frame of a man who'd known hunger and the calloused hands of someone who'd built more than he'd been given. His dark hair, now touched with premature silver at the temples, caught the morning light as he gazed up at the simple bell tower he'd constructed with his own hands and the help of a few generous townspeople. The bronze bell hanging there was his pride and joy, not from vanity, but from the pure, clear tone that had called the faithful to worship for the past 2 years. He'd carried that bell across 3 states, wrapped in wool blankets and secured in a specially built crate, determined to bring something beautiful to this rough frontier settlement. "Morning, Father," called out Martha Henderson, the baker's wife, as she hurried past with a basket of fresh bread. "Beautiful day the Lord's given us." "Indeed it is, Mrs. Henderson," Miguel replied, touching the brim of his simple black hat. "Will we see you and Thomas at evening service?" "Wouldn't miss it," she said with a warm smile, before disappearing into Garrett's general store. Miguel finished his coffee and was about to head back inside when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught his attention. 3 riders were coming in fast from the east, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Even from a distance, something about their hurried approach set his nerves on edge. The lead rider, a thin man with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen too many trails, pulled up near the saloon and called out to anyone within earshot. "Riders coming! Armed men, maybe 8 or 10 of them, heading this way fast." Sheriff Coleman emerged from his office, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. "How far out, Billy?" "Maybe 20 minutes, Sheriff." "They ain't riding friendly. Saw them scatter some cattle and shoot at the Peterson boy when he tried to get too close. Kids all right, but they meant business." Miguel set down his coffee cup and walked closer, his heart beginning to pound. In his 2 years in Cedar Ridge, they'd been fortunate to avoid the kind of trouble that plagued many frontier settlements, but he'd heard the stories from other towns. Raiders who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. "Everyone get inside and stay there," Sheriff Coleman ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd seen his share of violence. "Martha, get word to your husband and the others. We'll handle this." As the townspeople scattered to take cover, Miguel found himself torn between seeking shelter and staying near his chapel. The bell tower, visible from anywhere in town, would be an obvious target for men looking to send a message. He thought of the countless hours he'd spent polishing that bronze surface, the way its voice carried across the valley every Sunday morning, calling the scattered ranchers and their families to come together in faith and fellowship. "Father, you best get inside," Sheriff Coleman called out. "These men won't respect your collar if they're looking for trouble." Miguel nodded, but didn't move toward the chapel door. Instead, he climbed the wooden steps to the bell tower, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the rope. If this was to be the bell's last song, he wanted it to be heard across the entire valley, a call not just to worship, but to courage. The bronze bell sang out across Cedar Ridge, its pure, resonant tone echoing off the surrounding hills. 1, 2, 3 times Miguel pulled the rope, each peal seeming to hang in the morning air like a prayer made audible. From his vantage point in the tower, he could see the dust cloud approaching from the east, growing larger and more ominous with each passing moment. But he could also see something else, lone riders emerging from various directions, responding to the bell's call. Ranchers and their hands, men who lived scattered across the valley but recognized the sound of their community calling for help. Among them, riding hard from his spread to the north, was Jakob Brennan. Even at this distance, Miguel could recognize the man's distinctive silhouette, broad shoulders, straight back, and the purposeful way he rode that spoke of a man comfortable with both solitude and action. They'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words in 2 years, brief nods and polite acknowledgments when their paths crossed in town, but Miguel had always sensed something solid and dependable about the quiet rancher. The raiders crested the hill east of town, just as the last echoes of the bell faded away. Miguel counted 9 men, all armed, their faces hard with the kind of desperation that made men dangerous. They rode straight down the main street, whooping and firing their guns into the air, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust that settled on everything like a brown shroud. Miguel climbed down from the bell tower and stood in the doorway of his chapel, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever happened next, He would face it as he'd faced every other challenge since arriving in Cedar Ridge, with faith, dignity, and the quiet strength that had carried him through harder times than these. The raiders were here, and the morning's peace was about to be shattered like glass against stone. The raiders hit Cedar Ridge like a summer storm, sudden, violent, and leaving chaos in their wake. Miguel watched from his chapel doorway as they swept through the main street, their leader, a scarred man with cruel eyes, barking orders to his companions. "Check every building. Take anything worth taking," the leader shouted, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "And somebody shut up that damn dog." Miguel's hands clenched into fists as he watched them kick indoors and emerge with arms full of goods. Flour sacks from the general store, bottles from the saloon, tools from the blacksmith shop. Mrs. Henderson screamed from somewhere inside Garrett's store, and the sound made Miguel's blood run cold. But it was when they turned their attention to his chapel that his world truly began to crumble. "Boss, look here," called one of the raiders, a young man with dead eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. "Got us a pretty little church with a pretty little bell." The leader rode over, his horse's hooves clattering on the wooden planks of the chapel's front steps. He looked up at the bell tower with the calculating gaze of a man who saw dollar signs in everything. "That's bronze, boys," he said with a grin that revealed several missing teeth. "Worth good money in the right places. Jimmy, get up there and cut it down." "No!" Miguel stepped forward, his voice carrying more authority than his slight frame suggested. "That bell serves this entire community. It calls people to worship, warns of danger. It's not just metal, it's—" The leader's backhand caught Miguel across the face, sending him stumbling backward against the chapel wall. Stars exploded behind his eyes, and he tasted blood on his lips. "It's what, preacher?" the man snarled, leaning down from his saddle. "Sacred? Holy? Let me tell you something about holy. It don't put food in my belly or bullets in my gun." As Jimmy climbed the bell tower with a hacksaw, Miguel forced himself to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. Around him, he could see faces peering from windows and doorways, his parishioners, his friends, watching helplessly as their sanctuary was violated. The sound of the saw biting into metal was like fingernails on slate, each stroke sending shivers through Miguel's soul. He'd carried that bell so far, protected it through so much, only to watch it fall into the hands of men who saw nothing in it but profit. "Please," he tried once more, his voice barely above a whisper, "take anything else. Take my horse, my books, the collection money, but leave the bell." The leader laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You got spirit, preacher. I'll give you that. But you ain't got nothing else worth taking." From the edge of town, Jakob Brennan sat motionless on his horse, watching the scene unfold. He'd arrived with the other ranchers who'd answered the bell's call, but Sheriff Coleman had motioned them all to stay back. "Too many of them," the sheriff had whispered. "We wait for a better moment." Jacob's jaw worked silently as he watched the raiders systematically loot the town. His hands gripped his reins so tightly, his knuckles showed white through the tan of his skin. At 42, he'd learned the hard lessons that came with frontier life. Sometimes a man had to pick his battles. Sometimes the smart thing was to stay alive to fight another day. But watching that priest take a beating for defending his bell stirred something in Jacob's chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the quiet dignity the man showed even with blood on his face, or maybe it was the way he'd stood up to armed men without a weapon of his own. Either way, Jakob found himself memorizing every face among the raiders, burning their features into his memory like brands. The bronze bell came crashing down with a sound that seemed to echo through every soul in Cedar Ridge. It hit the ground with a hollow clang that felt like a death knell for more than just a piece of metal. Miguel dropped to his knees beside it, his hands hovering over the dented surface as if he could somehow heal it with touch alone. "Load it up, boys," the leader called out. "We got what we came for." As the raiders prepared to leave, their leader turned back to Miguel one last time. "Next time you want to play hero, preacher, remember this day. Some bells ain't worth dying for." They rode out as quickly as they'd come, leaving behind a town that felt somehow smaller, somehow less whole than it had been an hour before. The dust settled slowly, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that seemed to match the taste of defeat in everyone's mouth. Miguel remained kneeling beside the spot where his bell had fallen, his shoulders shaking not with tears, but with a rage so pure it surprised him. Sheriff Coleman approached cautiously, his hat in his hands. "Father, I'm sorry. We were outnumbered and—" "I know, Sheriff." Miguel's voice was steady now, though his hands still trembled. "You did what you could." The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of relief and shame. They gathered around their priest, offering words of comfort and promises that they'd help him rebuild, replace what was lost. But Miguel barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the empty space in his bell tower, and the silence that now filled it seemed louder than any sound he'd ever known. Jakob Brennan remained at the edge of town long after the other ranchers had ridden home. He watched the priest finally rise to his feet, watched him square his shoulders, and begin the work of comforting his flock despite his own devastation. There was something about the man's quiet strength that reminded Jakob of his own father, a man who'd faced every hardship with dignity intact. As the sun climbed higher, Jakob turned his horse toward home. But the image of that broken bell and the priest who'd bled defending it rode with him every step of the way. In his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, an idea was already beginning to take shape, an idea that would require skill, time, and a silence deeper than any he'd ever kept. 3 weeks had passed since the raiders took the bell, and Cedar Ridge felt different. Sunday services continued in the chapel, but without the bronze voice calling across the valley, attendance had dropped. Scattered ranchers who once rode in from miles away simply forgot, or perhaps found it easier to stay home when there was no reminder echoing through the morning air. Father Miguel went through the motions of his daily routine, morning prayers, visits to the sick, evening services, but Jakob Brennan could see the change in him. The priest's shoulders carried a weight that hadn't been there before, and his eyes held a sadness that no amount of faith seemed able to lift. Jakob had been watching, not in any obvious way. He was a man who understood the value of discretion, but from his ranch north of town, he made more trips into Cedar Ridge than usual, sometimes for supplies he didn't really need, sometimes just to water his horse at the trough near the chapel. Always he found reasons to observe the priest without seeming to. What he saw troubled him. Miguel Santos was a man slowly being crushed by the weight of his own disappointment, and the townspeople, well-meaning as they were, seemed unable to understand that their words of comfort only served to remind him of what he'd lost. On this particular evening, Jakob sat in his workshop as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold. The building, separate from his main house, was his sanctuary, a place where iron bent to his will and fire obeyed his commands. The forge glowed like a mechanical heart, and the familiar weight of his hammer felt solid and dependable in his calloused hands. But tonight, instead of shoeing horses or mending tools, Jakob was studying a piece of paper he'd sketched on earlier. It showed the rough dimensions and proportions of a bell. Not just any bell, but a recreation of the one he'd seen that morning 3 weeks ago, lying dented and broken in the dust. He'd never made a bell before. Horseshoes, yes. Hinges and buckles and wagon parts, certainly. But a bell required a different kind of skill, a precision and understanding of sound that pushed beyond mere metalworking into something approaching art. Jakob had spent the weeks since the raid reading every book on metallurgy he could find, traveling to the territorial capital to speak with other smiths, learning about bronze composition and the delicate balance between tin and copper that gave a bell its voice. He'd discovered that the shape, the thickness, even the temperature at which the metal cooled, everything mattered when it came to creating something that would sing instead of merely clang. The workshop door opened, letting in a cool evening breeze along with his ranch foreman, Tom Walsh. The older man had worked for Jacob for 5 years and knew his boss's moods better than most. "Working late again," Tom observed, settling onto a wooden crate that served as a makeshift chair. "That's the 4th night this week." Jakob didn't look up from his sketches. "Lot of work needs doing." "Uh-huh." Tom pulled out his pipe and began the familiar ritual of loading it with tobacco. "Funny thing, though. Been noticing you've been making an awful lot of trips to town lately. Mrs. Patterson at the general store mentioned you've been buying copper and tin, odd materials for ranch work." Jacob's hammer paused in its rhythm, but he still didn't look up. "Man's entitled to his business." "That he is." Tom struck a match and held it to his pipe, drawing deeply until the tobacco caught. "Course, there's also the matter of you asking me about bell-making last week. Specifically, how the old Mexican smiths used to cast them down in Santa Fe." This time Jakob did look up, his blue eyes meeting Tom's knowing gaze. "You got something to say, Tom? Just say it." The foreman smiled around his pipe stem. "Just wondering if you might need some help with whatever project you're working on. I may not know much about bells, but I know plenty about keeping secrets, and I know a man who's carrying a burden when I see one." Jakob set down his hammer and leaned against the workbench. Tom Walsh had been with him through the worst period of his life, those dark months after Jacob's wife Sarah had died of fever, when the ranch nearly fell apart and Jakob himself had come close to following her into the ground. If there was anyone he could trust with this, it was Tom. "The priest," Jakob said simply. "Been watching him since they took his bell. Man's dying inside, Tom. Dying slow, like a tree with its roots cut." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Heard he came out here from back east, carried that bell across 3 territories, meant something to him." "Meant something to the whole town," Jakob corrected. "You ever notice how things worked before? How that bell would ring on Sunday mornings and folks would come from all over the valley? How it rang when there was trouble and men came running to help?" "I noticed." Jakob picked up his sketch again, studying the proportions he'd drawn. "Town's coming apart without it. People staying home, keeping to themselves. That's not what Sarah would have wanted for this place." Tom's expression softened at the mention of Jakob's late wife. Sarah Brennan had been the kind of woman who brought out the best in everyone around her, who saw potential for community and connection wherever she looked. Her death had changed Jakob in fundamental ways, turning him inward and away from the social bonds she'd valued so highly. "So you're going to make him a new one?" Tom said. It wasn't a question. "Going to try?" Jakob folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "Don't know if I can do it justice, but I figure trying's better than watching him waste away." Tom stood up, knocking ash from his pipe against the side of the forge. "What do you need?" "Your word that you won't mention this to anyone. Not until it's done, if it gets done at all." "You got it." Tom moved toward the door, then paused. "Jakob, for what it's worth, I think Sarah would be proud of what you're doing." After Tom left, Jakob stood alone in his workshop, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving restlessly in the corral, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods along the creek. Somewhere in town, Father Miguel was probably reading his evening prayers by lamplight, the empty bell tower a constant reminder of his failure to protect what mattered most. Jakob fired up the forge again, its glow painting dancing shadows on the workshop walls. He had bronze to melt, molds to prepare, and a promise to keep, even if the man he was making it to would never know where it came from. The sound of hammers in the night carried across the valley, but to anyone listening, it was just Jakob Brennan working late again, as he had so many nights since his wife died. They couldn't know that each strike of the hammer was slowly, carefully, lovingly shaping something that would one day call a community back together. October brought the first hard frost to Cedar Ridge, and with it, a restlessness that seemed to settle over the entire valley like morning mist. Father Miguel felt it most acutely during his evening walks, when the silence that had once been filled with the bronze voice of his bell pressed against his ears like physical weight. He was returning from one such walk, his breath visible in small puffs against the crisp air, when he noticed smoke rising from Jakob Brennan's ranch in the distance. Not the thin, grey smoke of a cooking fire, but the thick, purposeful column that spoke of serious work being done. Miguel had noticed it several times over the past weeks, always in the evening, always lasting well into the night. As he climbed the steps to his modest quarters behind the chapel, Miguel found himself wondering about the solitary rancher. In 2 years they'd exchanged perhaps 20 words total, yet there was something about Brennan that intrigued him. Maybe it was the way the man carried himself, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd made peace with solitude. Or maybe it was the stories Miguel had heard about how Brennan had helped other ranchers during the harsh winter 3 years past, never asking for recognition or repayment. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Miguel was tending his small vegetable garden behind the chapel when he heard the distinctive sound of a horse approaching at an easy walk. He looked up to see Jakob Brennan dismounting near the chapel steps, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The rancher stood for a moment, his hat in his hands, clearly struggling with something. Miguel set down his hoe and walked over, curious about what could bring the reclusive man to his door. "Morning, Mr. Brennan," Miguel said, extending his hand. "What brings you to town today?" Jakob shook the offered hand briefly, his grip firm and calloused. "Father, I was wondering if you might have a moment to talk." There was something almost vulnerable in the way Jakob said it, as if the simple act of asking for conversation required considerable courage. Miguel found himself genuinely intrigued. "Of course. Would you like to come inside? I was just about to put some coffee on." Jakob glanced toward the chapel, then back at Miguel. That'd be fine." Miguel's quarters were simple but comfortable, a combination sitting room and kitchen, with a small bedroom beyond. Books lined makeshift shelves along one wall, and a simple wooden table dominated the center of the room. Miguel busied himself with the coffee, acutely aware of Jakob's eyes taking in every detail of the space. "You read a lot," Jakob observed, his attention caught by the collection of volumes. "Occupational hazard," Miguel replied with a slight smile. "Though I'll admit some of those are purely for pleasure. Dickens, Mark Twain, a few volumes of poetry. Do you read much, Mr. Brennan?" "Some. Mostly practical things. Ranching journals, weather almanacs." Jakob paused, then added quietly, "My wife used to read to me in the evenings. Poetry, mostly. Said it helped her think." It was the first personal information Jakob had ever shared, and Miguel sensed the significance of it. She had good taste. Poetry has a way of making us see familiar things in new ways. They sat in comfortable silence while the coffee brewed, each man lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Jakob cleared his throat. "Father, can I ask you something?" "Of course. That bell of yours and the one they took, what did it mean to you? I mean, really mean?" Miguel considered the question carefully. It wasn't the first time someone had asked, but something in Jakob's tone suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. "It was," Miguel began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "Have you ever had something that connected you to everyone and everything you cared about? That bell was my voice reaching across the valley every Sunday morning. It was how I called my flock together, how I warned them of danger, how I marked the important moments in their lives. Weddings, funerals, celebrations, that bell was part of all of it." Jakob nodded slowly. "And without it, I feel like I'm shouting into the wind. The community is fragmenting, Mr. Brennan. People are staying home, keeping to themselves. The very thing I came here to build is slowly coming apart." Jakob was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My Sarah used to say that some things are worth more than the metal they're made from. Said the value was in what they brought people together for." Miguel felt a sudden understanding pass between them. Two men who'd lost something precious, who understood the weight of absence. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Jakob looked up, meeting Miguel's eyes directly for the first time. "She would have liked you, I think, would have approved of what you're trying to do here." The conversation that followed was unlike any Miguel had experienced since arriving in Cedar Ridge. Jakob spoke haltingly at first, then with growing ease about his life on the ranch, about the challenges of working land that seemed determined to break a man's spirit, about the loneliness that had settled over him like dust since Sarah's death. In return, Miguel found himself sharing his own story, his calling to the ministry, his decision to come west, his dreams of building something lasting in this harsh but beautiful country. He spoke of his doubts, his moments of questioning whether he was strong enough for the work he'd chosen. "Strength isn't about not having doubts," Jakob said quietly. "It's about doing what needs doing, even when you're full of them." As the morning stretched toward noon, Miguel realized he was genuinely sorry to see their conversation drawing to a close. When Jakob finally stood to leave, there was a reluctance in his movements that suggested he felt the same way. "Mr. Brennan," Miguel said as they walked toward the door, "would you consider joining me for dinner sometime? I'm not much of a cook, but I make a decent stew, and I'd enjoy the company." Jakob paused in the doorway, his hat already back on his head. For a moment Miguel thought he might decline, but then the rancher nodded slowly. "I'd like that, Father. I'd like that very much." "Sunday evening, then? After services? I'll be here." As Jakob rode away, Miguel stood in his doorway, watching until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel quite so oppressive. He had no way of knowing that at that very moment, Jakob was thinking the same thing, that the loneliness he'd carried like a stone in his chest had lifted, just a little, and that the work waiting for him in his forge suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a gift he was preparing for a friend. In his workshop that evening, as Jakob carefully shaped the bronze that would become Father Miguel's new bell, each strike of his hammer carried not just skill and determination, but something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The first Sunday dinner had led to a second, then a third. By November it had become as regular as the sunrise, Jakob arriving at the chapel just as evening service ended, the two men sharing a simple meal and conversation that ranged from practical matters of ranch and community life to deeper questions of faith, loss, and what it meant to build something lasting in an uncertain world. Miguel had come to treasure these weekly gatherings more than he cared to admit. Jakob's quiet wisdom and dry humor had become a source of strength during the difficult weeks since the bell's theft. The rancher had a way of listening that made Miguel feel heard, and a perspective shaped by hard experience that often illuminated problems in new ways. What Miguel didn't know was that each Sunday dinner was followed by long hours in Jakob's workshop, where the bronze bell was slowly taking shape. The work had proven more challenging than Jakob had anticipated. The precise curves, the exact thickness needed for proper tone, the delicate balance between strength and resonance. He'd cast and recast sections multiple times, never quite satisfied with the sound they produced when tested. Tom Walsh had become his silent partner in the endeavor, helping with the heavy lifting and serving as a sounding board, quite literally, when Jakob needed to test the tonal qualities of his work. The foreman had also taken on the delicate task of gathering information about the original bell's dimensions and voice, visiting with townspeople who remembered it well and casually asking questions that helped Jakob refine his creation. "Getting close," Tom observed one cold November evening, running his hand along the nearly completed bell's bronze surface. "Sounds almost right when you tap it." Jakob nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Almost isn't good enough. Miguel deserves better than almost." It was the first time Jakob had referred to the priest by his first name, and Tom noticed. The friendship between the two men had grown deeper over the past months, built on shared meals and honest conversation. Jakob was a different man than the one who'd withdrawn from the world after his wife's death, more open, more connected to the community around him. "Maybe it's time to let him know what you're doing," Tom suggested gently. "Man ought to know he's got a friend looking out for him." Jakob was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the bell that represented weeks of back-breaking work and sleepless nights. "Not yet. Want to be sure it's right first." The breakthrough came 3 days later, during one of those sudden winter storms that swept across the high plains without warning. Jakob was working late, adjusting the bell's final details, when a gust of wind rattled the workshop walls. The vibration traveled through the building's frame and into the bell, causing it to emit a low, resonant tone that made Jakob's heart skip. That was it, the voice he'd been searching for. Not identical to the stolen bell, but close enough to carry the same authority, the same ability to reach across the valley and call people home. The next evening, Jakob loaded the completed bell into his wagon under cover of darkness. Tom rode alongside him as they made their way into Cedar Ridge, both men tense with the knowledge that discovery would ruin the surprise Jakob had spent so many weeks preparing. The chapel stood silent and dark, its empty bell tower a stark reminder of what had been lost. Working by moonlight, the two men carefully hoisted the new bell into position, securing it with ropes and hardware Jakob had crafted specifically for this purpose. The bronze surface gleamed dully in the pale light, and when Jakob gave it a gentle tap with his knuckle, it sang out clear and true. "Sounds perfect," Tom whispered. Jakob nodded, though his throat felt tight with emotion. "Sarah would have liked this," he said quietly. They were back at the ranch before dawn, and Jakob spent the morning in nervous anticipation. Would Miguel discover the bell before Sunday service? Would he know who had placed it there? Most importantly, would he understand the spirit in which it had been given? Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with a crisp blue sky that seemed to stretch forever. Miguel rose early, as was his custom, and stepped outside to begin his morning prayers. He was halfway through his first cup of coffee when he noticed something different about the chapel's silhouette against the sky. The bell tower was no longer empty. Miguel set down his cup with shaking hands and climbed the wooden steps to the tower, hardly daring to believe what his eyes were telling him. There, hanging exactly where his old bell had been, was a new one, smaller than the original but perfectly proportioned, its bronze surface polished to a warm glow. A folded piece of paper was tied to the bell rope with a simple string. Miguel's hands trembled as he opened it and read the brief message written in a careful, masculine hand. "For the voice that calls us home, a friend." Miguel sank to his knees in the bell tower, overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude, joy, and something deeper, the recognition that he was not alone in this harsh country, that someone had seen his pain and chosen to act. An hour later, the bronze voice rang out across the Cedar Ridge Valley for the first time in 2 months. The sound was glorious, clear and strong, carrying on the morning air like a promise of renewal. From his ranch to the north, Jakob Brennan paused in his morning chores and smiled at the sound, his heart full with the knowledge that his gift had found its purpose. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Families who hadn't attended service in weeks came streaming in from all directions. drawn by the familiar call that meant community, fellowship, and home. The chapel filled to overflowing, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. Miguel's sermon that morning was one of the finest of his life, speaking from a heart renewed about the power of unexpected gifts, about how grace often came through the hands of friends we might not even know we had. His voice carried clearly to every corner of the packed chapel, and when he spoke of gratitude and the bonds that held communities together, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. After the service, as the congregation slowly dispersed, Miguel noticed Jakob standing somewhat apart from the crowd, his hat in his hands. Their eyes met across the churchyard, and Miguel saw in the rancher's expression both pride and embarrassment, the look of a man who'd given a gift from the heart and wasn't sure how it would be received. Miguel walked over slowly, aware that this moment would define not just their friendship, but his own understanding of what it meant to be part of this community. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." Jakob shifted uncomfortably. "Don't know what you mean, Father. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The tone is perfect, better than perfect. It must have taken weeks of work." "Wouldn't know anything about that," Jakob replied, but his slight smile gave him away. Miguel stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Jakob could hear. "However it came to be there, I want you to know it's the most meaningful gift I've ever received. Not just the bell itself, but what it represents. That someone cared enough to act." Jakob looked up then, meeting Miguel's eyes directly. "That's what friends do, isn't it? Look out for each other?" "Yes," Miguel said, extending his hand. "That's exactly what friends do." As they shook hands in the shadow of the chapel, both men understood that something significant had changed between them. What had begun as one man's secret project to help another had evolved into something deeper, a friendship forged in bronze and tempered by shared understanding of loss, hope, and the courage it took to reach out to another human being. The bell continued to ring that afternoon, calling the scattered ranchers and their families to an impromptu celebration. Tables appeared as if by magic, laden with food and drink, and the main street of Cedar Ridge filled with music and laughter. Children played between the horses, couples danced to the sound of a fiddle, and the whole community came together in a way it hadn't since before the raid. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Miguel and Jakob sat on the chapel steps, watching their neighbors enjoy the unexpected festival their friendship had helped create. "Sarah would have loved this," Jakob said quietly. "She would have been proud of you," Miguel replied. "Building something beautiful, bringing people together, that's the best kind of legacy." The bronze bell caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like a beacon above them. It would ring for years to come, calling the faithful to worship, warning of danger, marking the passage of time and the seasons of life. But more than that, it would stand as a testament to what was possible when two very different men found common ground in their desire to serve something greater than themselves. In the growing twilight, the sound of laughter and music drifted across the valley, carried on the same wind that had once brought raiders and sorrow. But tonight, it brought only joy and the promise of tomorrow's bell calling everyone home.